Today I'm out in northern New Mexico with the 2022 Polestar 2. For the 2022 model year, Polestar has made some pretty substantial changes to their first electric vehicle, not the least of which is the price tag. There is now a model that will get you down after tax credits and incentives to about $35,000, making this one of the more affordable EVs in the United States. And there's also a new base dual motor version. That's the model I'm taking a look at first, although on the outside, honestly, the single motor and the dual motor look identical. Before we go on, I should address a question that I get very frequently when talking about Polestar vehicles. What's the relationship between Volvo and Polestar? Well, Polestar is partially owned by Volvo and partially owned by Volvo's parent company, Geely. Yes, effectively, it's all owned by Geely, but the reason they structured it in this way is that because once Volvo gets spun off at some point in the future, they would continue to own about half of Polestar. Polestar is an all-electric vehicle brand that really started inside Volvo, to be perfectly honest, and that's why the Polestar 2 looks an awful lot like a Volvo. This was the original Volvo 40 concept. Unlike other luxury brands that I could mention, Polestar absolutely does not shy away from their connection with Volvo because it's definitely an asset for them. This vehicle right now is manufactured in a Volvo factory in China. There is also a Polestar factory in China that is separate from the Volvo factory. Things get complicated, and the upcoming Polestar 3 is actually going to be built in the United States, in South Carolina, in a Volvo factory. So Polestar has the ability to leverage Volvo parts, Volvo components, Volvo supplier connections, which is really important, and of course, Volvo manufacturing and service component distribution, etc. So it's really an asset for this vehicle. Even though Polestar is a brand new electric car brand, they've sprung into existence very rapidly because they can draw upon expertise and logistics, etc. from the Volvo portfolio. The other important mission for Polestar is to be a technology incubator for Volvo and other related companies. So these are the vehicles that will get technologies first, like the Pixel LED headlights, the Google Infotainment system, the dual motor electric drivetrain, etc. Advances in electric drivetrains from the entire corporation, they're going to be spearheaded by Polestar, and then later they'll be adopted by the other brands. Now let's get back to the Polestar 2. This is just over 181 inches long. This is technically a compact luxury sedan, although it's a little bit more compact than most of the competition. This is about 3 to 4 inches shorter than options like the Tesla Model 3, or of course the BMW 3 Series, both of which you could consider direct competition to the Polestar 2. And that's because this is based on the same platform as the Volvo XC40, which was designed to not only create compact cars like this, but also subcompact vehicles. The other twist with the Polestar 2 is that it has a liftback, not a trunk. So even though this is shaped a little bit like a sedan, we have a practical liftback arrangement back here, making the format of this vehicle a little bit more like the Audi A7. I'm actually a little surprised that Polestar chose not to call this a crossover because it has a hair more ground clearance than the Ford Mustang Mach-E, and if you squint, this actually has about the same kind of profile as the Mach-E and the Model Y. The trunk lid, or what I guess you could call a trunk lid right back here, is pretty high off the ground. That really improves cargo practicality, and it definitely gives this something of a sedan meets crossover vibe. Aero is really important with the modern EV, but Polestar's made some interesting choices. They have these really slim side view mirrors, but we have regular door handles. These are the Pole-style door handles. They don't go flush in the vehicle, they're not motorized, anything like that. These logically are going to be a little bit more reliable than the motorized door handles, but there's another good reason for why Polestar decided to do this. They're going to be selling this vehicle in Europe and a lot of colder climates, where this kind of handle is just easier to open in the ice and the snow. An interesting touch with Polestar vehicles is that badging is kept to a very discreet minimum. We have a Polestar logo located right here on the front bumper. We then have removable stickers on the front doors. These stickers are the only way you'll be able to differentiate externally between the single motor and the dual motor. The dual motor puts out 300 kilowatts. That's the power output from the electric motors, 408 horsepower, 300 kilowatts. On the single motor version, that same sticker says 170 kW. And at the very back, we have another discrete Polestar logo. No other text on the rear bumper or the rear lid. Moving to the rear, we have a pretty distinctive light pipe that runs from one side to the other, amber LED turn signals, which are a nice touch, some discrete silver accents at the bottom of the bumper. Again, those can get blacked out if you get that option package. Parking sensors right down there at the bottom, and the release for this liftback is right there just above the license plate. Now let's dive into the Polestar 2's drivetrain because it has been updated for 2022. The dual motor version receives only a few minor tweaks, mainly having to do with efficiency and improving range. It's still 408 horsepower thanks to a dual identical motor setup, 204 horsepower in the front, 204 horsepower in the rear, 487 pound-feet of torque combined. The battery is also identical to last year's. It's a 78 kilowatt-hour nominal battery, 75 kilowatt-hours of that is usable. It's a modified skateboard battery, so it's a little bit different than some of the other EVs that we see out there. As you'd expect, there are advantages and disadvantages to the design. We still have a center tunnel here because that was part of the structure of the floor pan of the vehicle, but they were able to use it to put batteries in. They were also able to keep the footwells really low because no batteries are below the rear passenger's feet or the front passenger's feet. Instead, everywhere else in the vehicle has batteries, and then batteries are basically double stacked right back there behind the rear seats. Range is up for 2022, 249 miles, according to the EPA rating on this particular vehicle. If you get the single motor version, that's going to go up to 265 miles because they put just one motor in the vehicle, and that one motor is going to live up front on the front axle. Power goes up a little bit to 231 horsepower and 243 pound-feet of torque if you get that model. Logically, if there was customer demand, there's no particular reason that Polestar couldn't create a rear-wheel drive Polestar 2 with a single motor. That's entirely possible with this platform, but they chose to put the motor up front because it's likely a little bit less expensive than a single motor in the rear. There's a little bit less cabling going on. There are other high-voltage systems going on under the hood, like the heat pump that's optional for 2022, the air conditioning system that is standard, etc. The other two logical reasons have to do with regen braking ability and vehicle dynamics when regen braking. Remember that in any vehicle, the front tires and brakes are doing the vast majority of the braking, and we see something very similar in dual motor EVs. If you get the Polestar 2 with two electric motors, the front electric motor is doing the majority of the regen braking. The rear is doing some, but not as much as the front motor. And that's all because of vehicle dynamics. When you're braking a vehicle hard, the last thing you want to do is lock up the rear tires and not have any stability going on back there, especially if you're entering a corner or if you're on an icy surface. That's something that you will definitely notice in single motor EVs that are rear wheel drive with aggressive throttle liftoff regen. If you're in a corner and you lift off, you can get some squirreliness back there that you don't find in EVs where we just have an electric motor up front, and similarly aggressive regen is going on because this is naturally dynamically where the vehicle wants to do the majority of its braking. All things being equal, it's probable, although Polestar won't confirm this, that this is capable of regenerating more electricity because the motor's up front versus putting that single electric motor in the rear. And then of course, there's that stability improvement while regen braking. Speaking of dynamics, one thing that did surprise me is that the single motor version does not get a smaller tire size than the dual motor version. They both get 245 width tires. And they also get the same interesting wheel trick. The rear wheels are actually 1 inch wider than the front wheels. That gives the vehicle a little bit of a different driving dynamic because it effectively stiffens the sidewall on the tire in the rear, even though the tire itself is exactly the same between the front and the back. Now let's tackle charging and range. Charging happens behind the charge door right over here on the driver's side, just behind the rear passenger door. There's an onboard 11 kilowatt charger, so you could charge the battery completely in about 8 hours depending on the power source that you have availability with. That's of course from 0 to 100%. Most folks aren't going to be doing that. This will definitely charge the average daily commute in a relatively short window if you have an 11 kilowatt capable EVSE. DC fast charging has now been bumped up to 155 kilowatts. If you connect this to the appropriate level 3 DC fast charger, that's a little bit faster than before due to some refinements on the charge control systems. That update also applies to 2021 model year Polestars. If you live in a colder climate, you're probably going to want to select the heat pump option in the Polestar 2. That could give you an extra 10% bump in range depending on the climate that you're in. Over a day of driving, I found the driver's seat very comfortable, but this new seat design is a little bit interesting. I'm in the base version, so we don't get things like an extendable thigh cushion, and we don't get a power recline function. If I scoot this really close to the steering wheel, you can just barely see the knob right here. That's the seat recline knob. Now, what makes this unusual is that we still get a 4-way adjustable lumbar support right there on the seat and a 2-position seat memory for the driver's seat. The seat memory just doesn't adjust the tilt of the seat back. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column that's manual with a decent range of motion. Rather than a full manual passenger seat, the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. The only thing it's missing is the 2-position memory. When you jump into the back seat, it's important to remember that the Polestar 2 is on the small side for a compact luxury sedan, so we do find a little bit less legroom back here than we find in some other compact luxury options. But with the front seat all the way back in its tracks, I still have about 2 inches of legroom left. The seating area back here is pretty generous. Another change for 2022 is we can now get a traditional steel roof. So if you live in an area with a really hot climate and you aren't the biggest fan of that enormous sheet of glass helping bake your head as you drive down the road, you can now get it with a steel roof. Now that does seem to cut back on rear seat headroom just a little bit. If I sit back all the way in this seat, my hair is brushing the ceiling, I have about ½ an inch of headroom left. We still have a bit of a hump right there in the middle. We'll take a look at that in a bit, but it's not enormous. If I move over to the driver's side, you can see I have a little bit more legroom left with the front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. Polestar has done a really decent job packaging the battery. They utilized some of that space right there in the center tunnel for a battery, but you can see that they didn't inflate the center tunnel like we see in, for instance, a Toyota Mirai, where it has an absolutely enormous tunnel back there. Behind the power Sportback, cargo space comes in at just over 14 cubic feet. You should know that the way companies measure cargo area varies from company to company because there are a number of different standards, but the 14 cubic feet appears to be under this rigid cargo cover right here in the cargo area. So the trunk size in here is actually going to be a little bit bigger and more practical than you'd otherwise think if you're comparing this to a sedan. You could, of course, remove this hard cargo cover and put a lot more cargo in here. You could even put things like barbecues from a trip to Home Depot or Lowe's. But as you can see, there's not quite as much room just above there as there would be in a full-on SUV or crossover. Under the hood, there's a little bit of additional storage space, but not a great deal. You couldn't really put carry-on luggage back here. Under this cargo divider, lift that up, we find a tow hook, can affix the flat, and of course the inflator kit. When it comes to the exclusive Alex and Otto's Trunk Comfort Index, the Polestar 2 scores pretty well, because there's also some additional storage space right here under the load floor. Now, the way that this is shaped, it's not exactly usable for things like a spare tire or any kind of roller luggage, but you could certainly squeeze soft-sided luggage right down there. Here's a better look at what Polestar is calling the steel roof. Obviously it's steel on the outside, fabric on the inside. With this interior, Polestar is really focusing on environmental friendliness, so a lot of recycled materials, recyclable materials, vegan materials, etc., although you can still get Nappa leather if you want to. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts as well as height-adjustable headrests. This is the base interior fabric. It's stain-resistant and has some really cool geometric patterns going on. Aside from the manual recline adjustment, these seats feature a very similar design to the rest of the Polestar 2 seats, so pretty aggressive bolstering. They're definitely nice and grippy. The front seats are heated. Ventilated seats are available in the Polestar 2, but obviously not with the fabric seats. Moving over to the front seats, we find a lot of premium materials. Fabric for the speaker grills right there, a sort of wetsuit-like material right there for the armrest and around that grab handle, soft touch materials at the top of the door, and harder plastics down there around the bottle holders. A change on the interior for 2022 is that we get a bit more texture, so the base model has some different trim with these little dimples in it, fabric insert right there, soft touch materials above. This definitely has a very luxurious, very Volvo-like quality interior. The large tablet-like screen is the first implementation of Google's Android Automotive operating system, not to be confused with Android Auto. Android Auto is a phone projection system where your phone is projecting an Android window into an infotainment screen. This entire infotainment screen is actually running the Google Android operating system. Now, there are a few features that this software lacks at this exact moment. Apple CarPlay is still something that's coming later, as is Sirius XM satellite radio. But what's interesting is that this vehicle already has all the hardware for all of that, including the Sirius XM hardware. That was also on the 2021 Polestar vehicles, so you'll be able to add Sirius XM via a software update later. The software is really snappy, it's definitely easy to use, and there's going to be an app store where you can add apps yourself. You can also create apps apparently and just dump them onto the system if you want to. So for instance, Polestar created a press drive route app for us to use in this system. You'll actually be able to get a developer toolkit from Google so you can develop your own apps right here and then have them pushed to the App Store. Rather unfortunately, I can't show you the App Store because I don't have any connectivity, but you can see we have Spotify, the Bluetooth media player, radio, NPR One there. There are a bunch of different streaming apps. And Polestar says that they are also developing some games to be used within the system. So the system's graphics processor and main processor are capable of doing that kind of gaming function. Just above the infotainment screen, we find a center channel speaker, 2 air vents right there. You'll notice that there are not air vents lower for the driver and front passenger. More of that trim, no start-stop button. This is like other modern EVs where you simply put your foot on the brake, use this shifter right over here to shift it into gear, and then off you drive. When you want to turn it off, you just hit park, open the door, walk away, and the car turns off. Over here we have a power and volume knob, play pause right there, button for the defogger and defroster, 2 USB charge ports right there. You can see those charge ports. One of them is an interface port for the system right there, but the software, again, is not quite ready for Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. That's where you'd plug it in. We have a Qi wireless charging mat there, and you can see more of that trim around that shifter area. This is not a double tap shifter. This is a single pull, so we just pull back for drive, push all the way forward for reverse, and there's a little bit of a middle detent for neutral. Between the front seats, we find one cup holder. This cup holder arrangement does strike me as a little bit odd for North America, and then there is one more cup holder right back there, but you have to open this center armrest for that. And if you would rather use that second cup holder for storage, you can remove that, but obviously you can't use the two at the same time. In case you're wondering, this is what the Polestar key looks like. It looks very much like the Volvo key with the buttons right there on the side. An interesting touch you'll notice when you have that center console open is that we have a little airbag sticker right there on the front seats, both of them, because these front seats contain a side impact airbag for the center of the vehicle. In the event of a side impact collision, you'd get the standard curtain airbags coming down over there, and you would get a curtain airbag basically that pops out of the seat on this side and on the driver's seat over here as well, that keeps you from bumping noggins in the event of that side impact. On either side of the center console, there are also some additional storage areas. On the driver's side, we have a full LCD instrument cluster that gives us two basic views, one with a moving map display and one without. One thing that I appreciate is this power and charge gauge. It's difficult to demonstrate when I'm stationary, but hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that in the drive section. Obviously, power, this line moves over here and it shows you how much oomph you're using from the battery. Battery level is right over here on the right side, but the charge side is what I find interesting because it'll actually tell you when the vehicle is going to start to engage the friction brakes. So it'll turn orange as it goes over there to the left, and then it will enter sort of a hashed area as the friction brakes actually engage. That helps you really control how much regen you're getting. There are no updates to the steering wheel, so this is the same 3-spoke model that we saw before. The controls for the adaptive cruise control system is over here on the left. The controls for the infotainment system and that multifunction LCD are over there on the right. And then we have a split bottom spoke right there. Let's talk about the dual motor model out on the road first. Acceleration is definitely brisk. If I come to a complete stop here, we definitely get very aggressive acceleration. You can really feel yourself getting pressed back in the seat. The acceleration is very Tesla-like. This particular model goes 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds. That is definitely very, very swift. But perhaps more important than that 0 to 60 time is the directness of the acceleration. Very much like modern Teslas, when you press the accelerator pedal, you get a lot of oomph right away. This does not wait and ramp power slowly. So in that respect, this feels a little bit different than the Volvo XC40 EV. That ramps power a little bit more slowly. Here with the Polestar, they were being much more aggressive, and this really has an interesting feel to it as a result. The other thing you'll notice is that, as I've said before, the best way in my head to describe the way the Polestar 2 feels out on the road is this is exactly what would happen in my mind if BMW was tasked at designing, building, engineering, tuning, etc., a Tesla Model 3, but they had access to Volvo's parts bin, because a lot of the components in here feel very Volvo. The seats definitely feel Volvo. The steering wheel looks like a Volvo steering wheel with the Polestar logo right there. But this does not feel like a Volvo out on the road. This feels an awful lot like, I would say, electric BMW 3 Series, to be perfectly honest. The suspension system is tuned a little bit more gently than the Tesla Model 3, so this doesn't have that same sort of firm and bouncy feel. Unless you get the performance version, then that suspension is definitely stiffer and you get that sort of firm bobble feeling going on. But there's definitely enough suspension travel in this suspension design to soak up some of the larger bumps out on the road that I'm on. And then, of course, you get that really direct accelerator feel. Now, Polestar has chosen to tune this drivetrain to send more power to the rear unless all the power is called for. So obviously, if this is floored, then we have a symmetrical power setup where we get 408 horsepower total coming from the two electric motors. But in a lot of driving situations, it'll actually be sending more power to the rear. When it comes to handling, the Polestar 2 does extremely well. If you get the model with the performance package, according to Polestar, it will pull 0.9 Gs on a skid pad. That is very, very good for a modern electric vehicle, especially with 245 with tires on it. That is definitely better than what we see in the current Ford Mustang Mach-E, although I don't know what the Mach-E GT will be like. And that's kind of sort of a competitor to this, because the truth is that even though it has a Ford logo on the front and the pricing scheme is a little bit different on the Mach-E, because they're EVs and they're both performance EVs, there's definitely going to be at least a little bit of cross-shop. There's also obviously going to be cross-shop with the Tesla Model 3, but I prefer the way this suspension is tuned in the Polestar 2. It gives us a lot of the benefits of the Model 3, the directness of the acceleration, the low center of gravity, that definite feeling of EV stickiness out on the road, and secure and stable handling, but it actually dials the fun up a little bit. I prefer the way the steering is tuned in the Polestar 2 as well. The steering is a little bit too twitchy, a little bit too quick in the Model 3. Now, a lot of people get confused about this, so before anybody flames me out down there in the comment section, I am not talking about assist. Assist is adjustable in this, and it's adjustable in the Model 3. but you can never adjust the steering ratio in the Model 3. That's a gear in the steering rack, and that's not adjustable because it's actually a gear. And what I mean is that there are more turns lock to lock with this steering wheel, and so it feels a little bit less video gamey, a little bit less twitchy out on the road. It's easier to keep it centered. You don't feel like you're constantly adjusting course. The other thing you'll notice versus the Model 3 is that wind noise is much better controlled than the Polestar 2. All the panel gaps are very well aligned around the vehicle, and this model does not have the glass roof, which does seem to be a little bit quieter because obviously there's more insulation ability when you have steel, some insulation, and then some fabric right here. Now let's talk about what everybody's here for, the single motor version. If I just come to a complete stop, I'm on a winding mountain road here and I floor it, we don't have full power yet, full power. There we're 30 miles an hour approximately is where the full 230 horsepower seems to come on, at least according to the power gauge. And that makes sense because if Volvo allowed you to have 231 horsepower and over 230 pound-feet of torque on the front axle instantly, you'd get an awful lot of front wheel slip. And so unlike the Polestar 2 dual motor, they ramp the power up more gently like we see in other EVs. And that's one of the disadvantages to having the motor on the front. If Polestar had put the motor in the rear like we see some other EVs out there, you'd be able to get on the throttle a little bit more rapidly. Between 0 and about 25 miles an hour, acceleration may be a little bit more sluggish than some of the rear-wheel drive competition, but over 25, it's going to be substantially similar. 0 to 60 in this particular model happened in about 7 seconds. I wasn't able to test this on a perfectly level surface, and of course, I'm not at home. So be sure and keep that in mind, because I will have this at home for a complete weekly review just as soon as I can possibly get my hands on it. The other thing you're going to notice with the front-wheel drive drivetrain is that there is just a little bit of torque steer. It's very well controlled for a vehicle with this much oomph in it, but as you come out of these corners, especially if it's a little bit slippery in the corner and you floor it, you'll definitely feel the front wheels tug a little bit. In neutral handling situations where you're going around a corner power off, this feels identical to the dual motor version because other than the lack of the rear motor, it is identical to the dual motor version. We have the same tire sizes, the same tires, 245 width tires all the way around, and they even still have the staggered wheel setup where the rear wheels are wider than the front wheels. The weight balance does change a little bit. The dual motor version is nearly 50-50 when it comes to weight balance, and this is about 55-45 or so because 200 pounds is missing from the rear. The rear electronics module and the rear electric motor seem to weigh about 180-200 pounds or so. As far as ride quality goes, it's basically the same. Cabin quietness, ditto. You can't really hear the electric drivetrain. Unlike other EVs, there's really no hum from that electric motor or the battery systems. It's definitely very well hushed. This model also does not have the glass roof, so it's just as quiet when it comes to wind noise. As I said earlier in the video, the big benefit of having the electric motor up front rather than in the rear is regeneration ability as well as stability while the regen is on. Regen is very aggressive in this single motor version, almost as aggressive as the dual motor version. And that's actually quite logical because in the dual motor version, the front electric motor is the one doing most of the regen braking. You'll definitely notice the difference out on a windy road like this. If you're coming into a corner hot and regen is on high, in a rear regen vehicle, you can sometimes get the rear end to step out a little bit awkwardly, especially if the road surface is not absolutely perfect. And we don't see that in the Polestar 2. It's just a braking dynamics thing. Clearly, this is just a practical, rational limitation because in any rear motor EV, you could crank that regen dial up to 11 and have massive amounts of regen on the rear axle. It's just going to exacerbate that driving dynamic and that braking dynamic issue. And that's not something that we see in a vehicle like this. So if you live in a colder climate, theoretically, that's what the Polestar 2 is also designed for. This is going to be more sure-footed in terms of going up hills and going down hills and that regen braking feeling. It's also going to get more power into the battery. I've just gone from about 10,000 feet, I'm going down to 5,000 feet here, and I haven't hit the brake pedal once. Now this vehicle does have a blended braking system, so unlike modern Teslas, where you just have the throttle liftoff part, I can actually adjust the amount of regen I want here in the system. I can choose off, low, standard, and then I can choose whether I want the vehicle to creep when I let my foot off of the brake pedal or not. I really love the fact that this has blended braking because if you're going downhill like this and you want a more traditional feel, you can control the regen with just your foot on the brake pedal. You aren't limited to just that throttle liftoff regen. And again, it is quite aggressive. Now, I've got to admit to all of you that even though I completely understand the engineering rationale behind putting the electric motor just on the front axle, I kind of wish they'd put it just on the rear axle because it would have made this likely a little bit faster and a little bit more fun when you're out in your favorite winding mountain road. But again, there would be compromises in regen ability, there would be compromises in braking dynamics, there would be compromises likely in the EPA efficiency cycle, and probably a little bit of a compromise when it comes to range. And Gosh, that sounds like an awful lot of compromises, but for the fun nature of the vehicle, I think I would have wanted it on the rear axle. That also I think would have helped differentiate it a little bit from perhaps Volvo's future EV products, which are probably going to play it safe and put the motor on the front axle for a single motor version. And I also think it would have been in keeping with the character because the dual motor version of this is just so much fun. And it has a definite rear power bias. They definitely decided that when you stab the throttle. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. The Polestar 2 is going to start at $45,900 for 2022. That's less expensive than last year because we now have base models in dual motor and in single motor format. Obviously, the lowest price tag is going to be for the single motor, like the one that's right next to me. Visually, they are identical to one another. The only way you'll be able to tell is the sticker on the front doors. If you peel it off, nobody out there in the parking lot is going to know that you spent less. The cost for the dual motor upgrade is actually quite reasonable, surprisingly so. That's going to set you back $49,900. So it's just $4,000 extra to get 408 horsepower, 0 to 60 in under 4.5 seconds, and really be more fun than the base model, to be perfectly honest. It's not that this isn't fun. It handles just like the regular model. In fact, driving them back to back out on a winding mountain road, I really had troubles telling them apart, except when you press on the accelerator pedal. Then you're going to get more torque steer, obviously more front wheel scramble, and it's not going to be as quick. So if I were shopping for a Polestar 2, I would simply get the dual motor version. I think $49,900 is especially reasonable when you realize that this qualifies for the full $7,500 federal tax credit. That's going to make a Polestar 2 considerably less expensive for most shoppers out there than a comparably priced Model 3. Because at the moment, most EV shoppers, especially luxury EV shoppers, are going to qualify for that full $7,500 tax credit. Now, on the other hand, if you're looking at the base model and you're thinking $35,000, maybe I could upgrade from a Camry into something like a Polestar, keep in mind you have to have a minimum of a $7,500 federal tax liability in order to max that credit out, and you have to qualify for the other state, local, and regional incentives. If you want the heat pump that's newly available on the Polestar 2, you have to add the Plus pack to the base model. That's a $4,000 bump. In addition to the heat pump, we get the glass roof, so you can't have the steel roof with that particular option. We get heated rear seats, and we get a number of other interior tweaks, like an upgraded audio system. The Pilot pack for $3,200 brings you upgraded headlights. You get the Level 2 driver assistance system that's available on the Polestar 2, and adaptive cruise control, blind spot warning, and rear cross traffic detection. Some of those active safety features, again, are not standard on the base versions of the Polestar 2. And if you want to get carried away with options, you can of course add the performance package, which brings you the adjustable Öhlins dampers, the interior touches, the brake upgrades, etc. All of that is still available, and you can still get a Nappa leather interior with ventilated seats if that's something that you're interested in. Although Polestar has expanded the number of options and packages available for 2022, you'll notice that there aren't as many standalone options or as many option packages available as with some of the European competition. And a lot of that has to do with the way the Polestar 2 is sold. At the moment in the US, there are about 25 Polestar Spaces, as they're calling the dealers. They are still franchise dealers. By the end of the year, there will be 30. Polestar is only targeting major metro areas in the United States where EV adoption seems to be on the rise. So if you live in middle of nowhere, Nebraska, it's probably going to be a while until you find a Polestar Space near you. You should also know that the purchase experience is going to be a little bit different than buying a Volvo or a BMW or a Mercedes. You'll go to the Polestar Space, and as of this year, they will now have a very small local inventory of cars available. If you absolutely need a Polestar today, right now, that dealer should be able to assist you with getting into a Polestar today. If, however, you're willing to wait, say, a week to 2 weeks, then what they'll do is they'll try and match up the configuration that you would like with what's available at the port. It's already in the United States. It will then get shipped over to that Polestar dealer and then be delivered to you. If, on the other hand, you want a very specific configuration of Polestar, perhaps the absolute base trim with the least expensive color option, or perhaps an absolutely fully loaded most expensive Polestar 2, you may have to wait because it may have to get built, shipped to the United States. They're all manufactured in China at the moment, and then of course shipped on to the dealer. If you're not interested in visiting a Polestar Space, that's not a problem. You can complete your purchase online, the vehicle can be delivered to you, and they can even make arrangements for a trade-in online. Service is going to be handled in a very similar way. You simply make your appointment online. They'll either pick up the vehicle and take it to a service center, dropping off a loaner vehicle for you in the process, or they will actually repair the vehicle right on site if it's something that can be done that way. It kind of depends on where you are. At least for the moment, the Polestar 2 is one of my favorite new EVs in America. This is a ton of fun to drive, and it doesn't feel like some of the other big battery EVs out on the road. This definitely has a firm, sporty suspension tune to it, but it doesn't feel bouncy like we see in the Ford Mustang Mach-E or the Tesla Model 3 or the Tesla Model Y. They've definitely spent a lot of time refining the suspension tuning, and thanks to the design of this vehicle and the fact that it's related to something like the Volvo XC40, the suspension has a little bit more travel. And that's part of why this is not quite as low slung as something like a Model 3. You'll notice that the hood is a little bit higher, and the rear trunk area, or lift back area, whatever you want to call it, is definitely a little bit higher off the ground as well. Obviously, the boxier shape gives up a little bit of aerodynamic efficiency, but I think the payoffs are definitely worth it. And I also like the style. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. But I would say, bottom line, if you're looking at a Polestar 2 and you're considering the single motor, really trying to choose between the single motor and the dual motor, unless you really are on a tight budget, I would simply get the dual motor version. It is heaps of fun. It is a surprising amount more fun than the single motor version, and $4,000 isn't a great deal when we're talking about a vehicle that's already going to be up there towards $50,000. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and of course stay tuned because I will have my hands on this for a full and complete drive review just as soon as possible. I'll see all of you later.